We didn't notice when it started falling apart, Daniel Carter said quietly, staring at the small scratch on the wooden table that had been there for years, because nothing dramatic ever happened. Margaret looked at him with confusion, her eyebrows pulling together slightly, as if she were trying to understand a language she had never heard before. Ethan sat motionless across the table, his hands folded, watching his father carefully. Daniel took a slow breath and continued speaking, not loudly, not emotionally, just steadily, the way someone speaks when they have replayed the same memories too many times in their head. He explained that after Ethan was born, their life moved forward exactly the way most young families hoped it would. There were diapers, sleepless nights, early morning feedings, and the strange happiness that comes from realizing a tiny person now depends on you for everything. Margaret had been a wonderful mother from the very beginning. She sang softly while rocking Ethan in the living room, often humming old songs she remembered in the doorway sometimes and watched them, the yellow light from the lamp casting a soft glow over the small apartment. In those moments he believed everything was exactly the way life was supposed to be. But over time, something began to change. Not suddenly, not in a way that would alarm anyone. It happened slowly, the way winter creeps in when the days grow a little shorter each week. Daniel started working longer hours once he opened his repair shop. At first it was necessary. The business was small, and he needed to prove himself to customers. He would leave the house before 8 in the morning and often return after dinner. Margaret always understood, at least in the beginning. She told friends proudly that her husband was building something for their family, and Daniel truly believed he was. Yet every evening when he walked through the front door, he felt the quiet weight of the secret he carried. Sometimes he would see Margaret sitting on the couch with Ethan asleep on her shoulder, the television playing softly in the background. She would smile and ask how busy, he would say with a tired smile. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. As the years passed, their conversations became shorter, not because they disliked each other, but because life had filled every space with responsibilities. Ethan needed help with homework. The house needed repairs. Bills needed to be paid. Daniel told himself that silence was normal in long marriages. Many couples talked less once they had settled into routines. Yet deep inside he knew something else was happening too. The secret he had buried long ago had created a quiet distance between him and Margaret. It was like a thin sheet of glass that only he could see. They could still laugh together. They could still plan vacations and attend school events. But Daniel always felt as if he were standing one small step further away than he should have been. He remembered one evening about 10 years after Ethan was born. It was late autumn, and cold rain was tapping against the windows. Ethan had already gone to bed, leaving the house unusually quiet. Margaret poured himself a cup of coffee. She looked up and smiled at him. "You're working too much again," she said gently. Daniel shrugged and sat down across from her. "It's just a busy season." Margaret studied his face for a moment. "You've been saying that for years." Daniel laughed softly, trying to make the conversation lighter. But Margaret didn't laugh back. Instead, she reached across the table and touched his hand. "Daniel," she said carefully, "sometimes it feels like you're somewhere else even when you're sitting right here." The words stayed with him long after that night. He remembered looking down at their hands on the table and realizing she was right. A part of him was somewhere else. A part of him was always standing in that hospital hallway 25 years earlier, listening to the doctor's voice echo in his memory. Daniel never told Margaret that. Instead, he squeezed her hand and said the only thing he could think of. "I'm just tired." Margaret nodded slowly, accepting the explanation even though it didn't fully satisfy her. That was the strange thing about their marriage. So whenever something uncomfortable appeared, they quietly stepped around it and kept moving forward. Years continued to pass in that quiet way. Ethan grew into a teenager with an easy smile and a love for baseball. Daniel rarely missed his games, standing near the fence with other parents while the afternoon sun warmed the field. Margaret brought homemade sandwiches and cold lemonade in a cooler. From the outside, the Carter family looked happy, and in many ways they truly were. But Daniel's silence slowly shaped the space between him and Margaret. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet it affected small things. He stopped sharing certain thoughts with her because he worried they might lead to questions. He avoided talking about the past, especially the months surrounding Ethan's birth. Margaret noticed these patterns without fully understanding them. Sometimes she would ask simple questions about those early years, and Daniel would give short answers before gently changing the subject. Over time, Margaret stopped asking as often, not because she lost memories made Daniel uncomfortable. One summer evening when Ethan was about 16, Margaret sat on the back porch watching the sunset spread across the sky in shades of orange and gold. Daniel joined her with 2 glasses of iced tea. For a while they sat quietly listening to crickets in the yard. Then Margaret spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "Do you ever think about how strange it is that we've been together so long?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Strange how?" "Just how quickly the years went by," she said. "Sometimes I feel like we blinked, and suddenly our son is almost grown." Daniel nodded. He knew exactly what she meant. Time had a way of moving faster the older you became. Margaret looked at him, then with a small, curious expression. "Do you ever wish we had talked more back then?" When Ethan was little, Daniel felt the familiar tension in his chest. "What do you mean?" Margaret shrugged slightly. "I don't know. Sometimes I think we were both so busy surviving that we never really talked about what we were feeling." Daniel stared out at the yard where Ethan had grass was darker now, the sunlight nearly gone. "Maybe," he said quietly. Margaret watched him carefully. She seemed as if she might say something else, but eventually she just nodded and took a sip of her drink. The conversation drifted to other topics after that, but the feeling remained. Over the years their marriage didn't collapse with shouting or anger. Instead, it slowly settled into a quiet distance neither of them could fully explain. They still cared deeply for each other. They still shared holidays, birthdays, and everyday routines. Yet there were moments when Daniel sensed Margaret looking at him as if she were searching for something she couldn't quite find. And every time he saw that look, he felt the weight of the secret grow heavier. Because the truth was simple. Silence doesn't just hide things. Sometimes it changes the shape of a relationship entirely. Daniel realized this more clearly as Ethan became an adult. When Ethan moved 300 miles away for college, Margaret cried in the driveway while Daniel held her shoulder. They walked back into the house together. The rooms felt unusually quiet without their son's presence. That evening Margaret sat at the kitchen table again, the same place where she had once told Daniel he seemed distant even when he was home. She looked around the empty room and said softly, "It's strange, isn't it?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah." Margaret gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Now it's just us again." Daniel looked at her across the table and suddenly felt a wave of regret he had never allowed himself to feel before. Because the woman sitting in front of him had shared his entire adult life. She had trusted him through every challenge. And yet there was still a truth about their past that she did not know. That realization stayed with him for years afterward. It followed him through holidays, family visits, and quiet evenings in the living room. It lingered in the background like a distant echo. And eventually it became impossible to ignore once the letter arrived 3 months ago. Daniel glanced around the dinner table now, returning to the present moment. Margaret remained silent, sensing the story was far from finished. Daniel folded his hands together again and spoke slowly. "The truth is," he said, "our marriage didn't fall apart in one dramatic moment. It changed little by little, because I chose silence instead of honesty." He paused for a moment, looking directly at Margaret. And that silence started the night Ethan